"You don't fucking belong here." The words weren't whispered. They weren't a polite suggestion. They were a detonation, a piece of verbal shrapnel tearing through the shimmering champagne-soaked air of the St. Regis Grand Ballroom. It was a gala for the city's old money and new gods, a place where fortunes were paraded in the form of silk, diamonds, and surgically perfected smiles. The voice belonged to the woman in the blood-red dress, a slash of crimson against the ballroom's gold leaf and ivory. She was Eleanor Vance, wife of the real estate titan Arthur Vance, a man who didn't just build skyscrapers, but seemed to own the very sky they pierced. Her dress was a statement, a second skin of liquid silk clinging to a frame maintained by dietitians and discipline, its hemline a defiant slash just above the knee. Her lips, painted the exact shade of arterial blood, were curled into a weaponized smirk. She didn't just speak. She broadcasted, pitching her voice like a stage actress aiming for the last row of a hostile theater. Everywhere, motion ceased. Forks loaded with caviar paused inches from mouths. Crystal glasses of vintage Dom Perignon froze mid-air. The soft, elegant melody of the jazz trio in the corner stumbled, a saxophone letting out a wounded squawk before falling into a terrified silence. Heads swiveled on necks adorned with fortunes in jewelry, a slow, synchronized turn of the city's elite. They weren't looking at a clumsy waiter or a misbehaving member of the hotel staff. Eleanor Vance had aimed her poisoned dart with precision. Her target was the woman sitting alone at a table near the front, a table bathed in the soft, crystalline light of a low-hanging chandelier. The woman in the burnt orange gown. She was a figure of profound, almost defiant stillness. A black woman, her posture an exercise in regal calm, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, from which not a single strand dared to escape. Her dress was the color of a dying flame, a rich, burnt orange satin that didn't glitter or shout. It flowed, a quiet river of fire against the sea of ostentatious sequins and diamonds filling the room. Until this moment, she had been a portrait of invisibility, a ghost of quiet dignity at a party designed for peacocks. Eleanor leaned in, a predator moving toward its prey, her laugh a high, brittle thing that seemed to shatter against the crystal chandeliers. "Sweetheart," she cooed, the condescension dripping from the word like venom. "This isn't general admission. This is the Founder's Circle, reserved for names that built this city. You must have taken a wrong turn from the kitchens." A low hum, a collective murmur vibrated through the velvet-draped walls. It was the sound of scandal being born. Phones, previously tucked away, began to shift in hands. A few screens blinked to life, their lenses aimed discreetly. The woman in orange offered no reply. She didn't flinch. She simply lifted her champagne flute, the pale gold liquid catching the light, and took a slow, deliberate sip, as if the insult were a minor disruption, a fly buzzing in another room. But the room felt it. Oh, everyone felt it. This wasn't a simple faux pas. It was a public execution of belonging, a territorial marking spray of prejudice and power. Smirks blossomed on powdered faces. Knowing glances were exchanged between men in $1,000 tuxedos. This was the evening's entertainment. Somewhere near a marble column at the back, a young, hungry reporter named Ben Carter, his tie perpetually loosened, tapped his phone's camera on. He angled it low, whispering into its tiny microphone. "Holy shit, this is it. This is bigger than some society spat." Emboldened by the woman's silence, Eleanor pressed her attack. "I've seen your type before," she announced to the tables around her, making them her jury. "Trying to get a taste of a life you'll never have. Slipping into an empty seat, hoping no one notices. Security should have a much tighter leash on the door." A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the front row. A man chuckled, a nervous barking sound, trying to frame it as a joke, but the poison had already seeped into the atmosphere. A brutal, invisible line had been drawn down the center of the St. Regis ballroom. On one side, those who belonged. On the other, the woman in orange. And still, she did not react. Her calm was more unsettling than any protest, more profound than any shouted defense. She placed her glass back on the pristine white linen, her hands folding in her lap with a surgeon's precision. Her eyes, deep and unreadable, lifted. They didn't land on Eleanor Vance. They looked past her, through her, toward the magnificent, multi-tiered chandelier that hung like a galaxy of frozen fire above them all. And in that charged, suffocating silence, the very air in the ballroom seemed to bend. Before we see how this firestorm ends, I have to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. And more importantly, have you ever been made to feel like you don't belong? Drop a yes in the comments if you know this feeling. And while you're down there, do me a favor and smash that like button and subscribe to this channel, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of the justice that's coming. We believe these stories can spark real change, and we're so glad you're here to witness it with us. Now, let's get back to the woman in the orange gown. Because in the next 10 minutes, her silence is going to cost an entire empire $4.1 billion. She didn't rise. She didn't answer. The woman in the orange gown, who we will come to know as Serafina James, simply maintained her posture, her spine straight, her focus seemingly fixed on the empty stage at the front of the ballroom, as if Eleanor Vance's venomous words were nothing more than meaningless background noise. But the silence wasn't empty. It wasn't passive. It was a living thing, pressing down on the opulent room with a weight far heavier than the crystal chandeliers. Every person in that ballroom felt its crushing gravity. Eleanor Vance, a woman accustomed to a world that bent to her will, mistook this profound silence for weakness. Her smile, already cruel, widened. The curve of her blood-red lips looked like a freshly sharpened blade. "See?" she announced to her audience of gawking elites. "She knows it. That's why she won't speak. She knows she shouldn't even be breathing this air." The laughter that followed wasn't a roar, but it was just as sharp. It was the clipped, knowing chuckle of the privileged, a sound that cut from table to table, affirming a shared, ugly bias. A man in a Brioni tuxedo clinked glasses with his companion, a dismissive gesture, but his eyes, like everyone else's, remained locked on the silent woman. In a room built for spectacle, judgment travels faster than light. Serafina's stillness was not the stiffness of fear. It was the controlled stillness of immense discipline. Her hair, pulled back into that impossibly tight chignon, wasn't a style chosen for vanity, but for battle. It was armor. Every line of her posture, from the straightness of her spine to the calm placement of her hands, screamed a single silent message. This is not new. And it wasn't. The ghosts of 100 similar moments were sitting with her at that crystal-lit table. She was 22, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and imposter syndrome, standing in the marble-floored lobby of the Hotel Plaza Athénée in Paris. She had saved for 2 years for that trip, a pilgrimage to see the art she had only ever studied in textbooks. She was wearing her best dress, a simple navy blue sheath, when the concierge, a man with a perfectly sculpted sneer, stopped her. "Excuse me, mademoiselle," he'd said in clipped English, his eyes flicking over her as if she were a piece of dirt on his polished floor. "The catering staff must use the service entrance." The words had landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The shame so hot it felt like it was melting her from the inside out. She hadn't said a word then, either. She just turned and walked away, the shame clinging to her like a shroud. She was 29, a rising star in a Chicago investment firm, the only black woman on her team. She had just closed a deal that had made her partners millions. To celebrate, she went to the city's most exclusive rooftop bar. As she approached the roped-off VIP section, a bouncer with a neck as thick as a tree trunk blocked her path. "Whoa, hold on," he'd grunted, looking past her to the group of white men behind her. "This section is reserved for the real investors." He'd gestured for the men to enter, and they had, laughing as they passed her. The memory of their laughter, the casual cruelty of it, still burned. Exclusion delivered in public, dignity tested in silence. Each memory was a scar, invisible to the eye, but deeply felt. And now, decades later, in a ballroom that smelled of money and roses, the same tired, ugly script was being played out once more. Only this time, the stage was hers. Across the room, Ben Carter, the young journalist, leaned against a marble column, his phone held steady, angled discreetly toward the drama. He whispered into his lapel mic, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't just high society gossip. This is a story about power, about who gets to decide who belongs. Keep rolling, no matter what." Meanwhile, Eleanor, high on her perceived victory, pivoted to a nearby cluster of guests, her voice loud and performative. "Honestly, it's just embarrassing for the St. Regis. Someone should have been checking credentials at the door. A seat like this?" She paused, her eyes raking over Serafina's form, from the elegant chignon to the hem of her satin gown. "Isn't for that." The word landed. That. A single dehumanizing syllable. Gasps, sharp and audible, rippled through the nearby tables. A woman's hand flew to her mouth, her diamond bracelet catching the light. A man shifted in his tuxedo, the fabric groaning in protest at his discomfort. Another voice whispered, loud enough to be heard 2 tables away. "Oh my God, did she really just say that?" Still, Serafina James did not move. She reached for her champagne flute again, the motion slow, fluid, and deliberate. She raised it, not to her lips this time, but held it for a moment, letting the light refract through the crystal. Then she placed it back on the white linen tablecloth. The act was mundane, a simple gesture. But in a room supercharged with tension and drunk on opulence, her profound restraint felt extraordinary, almost holy. Ben Carter muttered into his mic again, his voice now filled with a kind of reverence. "She's not reacting. She's letting the room react for her. It's genius." And the room was. The smirks had vanished, replaced by frowns of discomfort. The knowing glances were now ones of shock. The murmurs grew heavier, darker. The air, once perfumed with the sweet scent of success, now carried something sour and rotten. Bias, exposed under the bright lights, raw, ugly, and undeniable. Eleanor Vance, lost in her own cruel performance, didn't see it. She was the star of her own show, and she was playing for the rafters. "Security," she called out, her voice slicing through the faltering jazz music like a razor. "Get her out of here before this turns into a complete circus." The gala, the entire glittering affair, shuddered to a halt. Waiters carrying trays of canapes paused mid-step. The hotel's general manager, standing at the edge of the stage, stiffened, as if he'd been struck by lightning. A spotlight of shame had been switched on, and its unforgiving glare was now on everyone. And through it all, the woman in the orange gown, the eye of the hurricane, still hadn't spoken a single word. The word security had barely left Eleanor's lips when a man in a flawless black tuxedo materialized at the edge of the ballroom. This was Mr. Davenport, the general manager of the St. Regis, a man whose silver hair was slicked back with military precision and whose discreet earpiece was a permanent fixture. He moved with the practiced speed of a man used to extinguishing social fires, but tonight his steps lacked their usual confidence. There was a hesitation in his gait, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had heard the tone, he had seen the gesture, and now the weight of 200 pairs of eyes was on him, waiting to see how he would navigate this minefield. Eleanor Vance greeted him not with relief, but with a triumphant tilt of her chin, as if her personal cavalry had arrived. "Finally, Davenport," she said, her voice dripping with command. "Please escort this woman out. She's taken a reserved seat at a benefactor's table. It's utterly humiliating for the hotel." Davenport's gaze shifted, reluctantly, toward the woman in the orange gown. Serafina hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She simply rested one hand on the crisp linen, the other still curled loosely around the stem of her untouched champagne flute. Her eyes met his. They were steady as granite. There was no plea in them, no hint of defense, just a deep, unwavering silence that demanded he think very, very carefully before taking his next step. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Madam," he began, his voice a strained attempt at neutrality, "may I please see your invitation card?" The request itself, though seemingly standard, carried the full weight of the accusation. In a gala built on the unspoken rule that if you were there, you belonged, asking for proof was a public indictment. Eleanor Vance leaned closer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper laced with condescension, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Don't waste your time, Davenport. I've seen her type at enough of these events. They buy a convincing knockoff dress, slip past the ushers, and sit where they don't belong, hoping to catch a rich man's eye. Do your job." That final phrase, "do your job," landed like a slap. Guests shifted uncomfortably. A woman at the next table whispered to her husband, "She's not even letting him speak. This is a witch hunt." The husband murmured back, his eyes narrowed. "This feels deeply wrong. The woman hasn't done a single thing." Near the back, Ben Carter steadied his phone, his grip tightening. His whispered commentary turned sharper, more analytical. "They're trying to erase her with protocol, using the rules not to maintain order but to enforce a bias. This is the playbook." Davenport's hand hovered uncertainly over the table, as if he were about to reach for Serafina's place card. But before his fingers could touch the pristine white stock, Serafina moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion, but it was charged with authority. She placed her fingertips gently on the card, claiming it. Her voice still didn't come. Not yet, but her eyes held the manager in place, a silent command to halt. The entire ballroom noticed. The quiet hum of conversation died completely, pulling the faint jazz music down with it into a void of silence. Waiters froze mid-pour, bottles of champagne hovering over empty glasses. Even Eleanor Vance, for the briefest of seconds, faltered, her smug smile flickering. Pride, however, quickly reloaded in her eyes. "Sir," she pressed, her voice louder now, ensuring the entire room was her witness. "She does not belong. Remove her before this becomes a scene." But it already was a scene. It had been from the moment her first insult had sliced through the air. Now it was a drama unfolding in real time, under the unblinking gaze of crystal chandeliers and 100 watchful eyes, with dozens of phones capturing every flicker of prejudice, every breath of silence, every nuance of this slow-motion car crash of dignity and arrogance. And still, the woman in the orange gown, the woman they were trying to erase, had yet to speak a single word. The ballroom, and by now a growing online audience, waited. "Okay, we gotta pause here for a second. The manager, Davenport, has a choice to make. The whole room, the whole world is watching. What do you think he's about to do? And what would you do if you were in his shoes? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments. Your engagement, your voice, helps stories like this get seen by the people who need to see them most. It matters. Now, let's get back to the ballroom. Davenport's hand hovered over the table card, suspended in the thick, tense air like it was the trigger of a bomb. Serafina didn't flinch. She didn't scramble to defend herself, didn't raise her voice in protest, didn't even allow her expression to sour. Instead, she placed her glass down on the table with a soft, deliberate clink. The faint sound was louder, more resonant than any shout could have been. Her stillness was a tactical weapon, and it was disarming the entire room. In a place where power was always loud, always performative, her silent refusal to engage was a language no one there understood, and it terrified them. Eleanor Vance, however, continued to read from her worn-out script of privilege, mistaking quiet for capitulation. "See?" she sneered, leaning into the silence. "Not a single word. She knows she's been caught. She knows she's out of place." But the silence wasn't surrender. It was a holding pattern. It was a gathering of strength. It was pure, unadulterated presence. Guests who had been snickering just moments before now simply stared, trapped in a state of profound discomfort they couldn't quite name. Why wasn't she fighting back? Why wasn't she crying or screaming or desperately trying to justify her existence in this room? At a nearby table, a woman adorned in pearls that cost more than a suburban home whispered to her friend, "If that were me, I'd be in tears. I'd be absolutely mortified." Her friend, a shrewd-looking woman with calculating eyes, shook her head slowly. "That," she murmured back, "is why it's not you. Look at her. She's not giving them the satisfaction. She's not giving them anything at all." In the corner, Ben Carter's whispered narration into his phone mic had become almost reverent. "She's holding the entire room hostage with her silence. You can feel it. It's a physical presence. It's heavier than the music, heavier than the damn chandeliers." Eleanor either didn't hear this shift, or more likely, chose to ignore it. She raised her glass in a mock salute, her voice ringing sharp as crystal. "Let's toast," she announced with a brittle laugh, "to keeping these events exclusive, to standards." It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a desperate performance. She was trying to rally the crowd back to her side, to reinforce the invisible walls of their shared world. But the crowd was no longer with her. They weren't laughing. They were watching, their faces a mixture of fascination and horror. Davenport, the manager, cleared his throat again, the sound a dry rasp. He was visibly uncomfortable in his assigned role as enforcer. His fingers finally brushed against the edge of the table card, but Serafina moved a fraction of an inch, just enough to cover the card completely with her palm. No words. No fight. Just a simple, undeniable act of ownership. The gesture, so small, landed with more force than a shouted argument. In that moment, another ghost entered the ballroom, another memory pressing into her mind like a fresh scar. She was 16 years old, standing in the lobby of a grand hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was her first time attending a statewide debate competition. She was dressed in her Sunday best, a new dress her mother had worked overtime to afford, clutching her notes and her purse with trembling hands. She was just trying to find the conference room when a clerk at the front desk called out, his voice laced with suspicion, "Excuse me, this area is for hotel guests only." She had tried to explain about the debate, but he hadn't listened. He and a security guard had escorted her out, pushing her onto the hot sidewalk as if she were trash. They didn't listen then. They just saw a young black girl where they didn't think she belonged. Now, decades later, the universe was trying to repeat the same ugly pattern, only this time, she was not the one who was trembling. Her silence wasn't empty. It was filled with decades of refusal. A refusal to bend, a refusal to break, a refusal to be erased from a room she had every right to be in. And though her lips had not yet parted, the entire ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers and its ugly prejudices, was beginning to hear her loud and clear. It began as a single point of light. From the far corner of the ballroom, the small red recording light on Ben Carter's slim black phone blinked alive. Ben, barely 30 but with the world-weary eyes of a veteran journalist, angled his camera low, his lips moving almost silently as he narrated the scene. If you're just joining the live feed, you need to see this. Remember what you see here. Remember how it all started. With one sentence. A ripple of awareness. A new kind of tension passed through the room. It wasn't just a spectacle anymore. It was being documented. A woman in a shimmering emerald silk gown elbowed her husband, nodding subtly toward Ben's lens. The husband frowned, whispering back, his hand shielding his mouth. "Be careful, darling. They'll throw him out, too." But Ben didn't stop. He zoomed in, framing the shot perfectly. The visual contrast was cinematic. Eleanor Vance, in her blood-red dress, standing tall, sharp, loud, and accusatory, and Serafina James, in her burnt orange gown, seated, silent, and utterly unshaken. Two women, two worlds, two definitions of power, colliding in real time under the unforgiving glare of the public eye. "Excuse me." A new voice, clear and steady, carried from a nearby table. A middle-aged guest, a man with silver cufflinks that glinted in the light, had raised his glass halfway. "Why does this woman need to prove anything to you?" he asked, his question directed squarely at Eleanor. "She's seated at an assigned table. That should be proof enough." Eleanor spun on her heel, her reaction a clipped, metallic laugh that held no humor. "Oh, please," she scoffed, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "You clearly don't know these people. They sneak in. They pretend to belong. This is precisely why standards matter. To protect us from them." Her words, particularly "these people," ricocheted off the chandeliers and landed like grenades in the tense silence. This time the reaction was not subtle. Gasps echoed openly. Whispers turned to hisses. A woman near the stage shook her head sharply, muttering to her companion, "Did she just say, 'these people' in 2025? The manager, Davenport, froze completely. His hand hovered mid-air, caught in an impossible position between a powerful guest's ugly demand and the rapidly souring mood of the entire room. He could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, the glare of a dozen phone cameras, all waiting to see which side of history he would choose to stand on. Serafina still didn't move. She hadn't spoken a single word, but her profound stillness was rewriting the entire script of the night. The aggressor was starting to look frantic and shrill. The target looked composed and powerful. The crowd, the jury of her peers, was beginning to choose who they believed. Ben Carter's voice whispered urgently into his mic. "Stay on her. Stay steady. This isn't silence anymore. This is strategy. Watch how the entire room is bending toward her." Another phone rose, then another. The guests, at first trying to be discreet, were now openly recording. Their screens glowed in the dim light, catching the raw tension, the stark imbalance, the breathtaking arrogance on full display. Eleanor Vance noticed the sea of glowing screens. Her smile cracked for a moment, then reloaded, even sharper, even more brittle than before. She raised her chin in defiance. "Record all you want," she spat. "It won't change a thing. She'll be gone in 5 minutes. Security is already on its way." But her voice, for the first time, held a slight quiver at the edges, because even she, in her bubble of privilege, could feel it. The room wasn't laughing with her anymore. It was listening to her. It was recording her. It was storing every single one of her venomous words like evidence for a trial. And still, the woman in the orange gown said nothing. The ballroom's tension thickened, becoming as tangible as the smoke clinging to the velvet curtains. Eleanor stood taller now, feeding on her own toxic echo, a queen presiding over a court that was rapidly turning against her. And then, Davenport, the manager, finally made his move. It was a choice that would seal his fate. His hand swept across the table, snatching the place card from beneath Serafina's calm, unmoving palm. He held it high, his voice ringing out like a judge delivering a verdict. "This is invalid," he declared, his voice shaking slightly. "You are not on tonight's registry." A collective gasp rattled the crystal flutes. Guests leaned forward, straining to read the name on the card from afar. Ben Carter's phone zoomed in, capturing every syllable, every tremor in the manager's hand. Serafina didn't rise. She didn't try to snatch the card back. She simply folded her hands in her lap, her eyes never leaving the manager's face. Eleanor Vance clapped her hands together once, a single mocking round of applause. "Finally! Thank you, Davenport. Now remove her before she embarrasses herself any further." But Davenport wasn't finished. His performance of humiliation was just beginning. He placed the card flat against his palm, holding it out like evidence in a courtroom. His tone sharpened, hardened with a newfound desperate authority. "Madam, this table is reserved for our highest-profile donors. I cannot allow you to remain seated. Please cooperate, or our security team will be forced to intervene." From the third row, a man in a tuxedo called out, his voice booming with indignation. "She's been sitting here calmly this whole time. Why are you treating her like a common trespasser?" Davenport's jaw tightened. He shot a look at the man. Then his eyes snapped back to Serafina. "Because," he said, the words cracking across the ballroom like a whip, "calm does not equal credibility, and silence does not equal access." Those words, "calm doesn't equal credibility," landed with a sickening thud. They weren't just procedural, they were a personal attack, a philosophical judgment. They carried the sting of a deep, systemic accusation, the certainty of a dismissal rooted in something far uglier than a simple seating chart error. Eleanor smirked, circling the table like a victorious predator savoring the final moments of the hunt. "You hear that?" she gloated. "Even the management agrees. You don't belong. Not here. Not at this level." Phones tilted higher, no longer hidden in laps but held aloft like torches. The screens glowed like tiny spotlights, all aimed squarely at the spectacle of arrogance and prejudice. Serafina inhaled once, a slow, deliberate breath, but she still didn't speak. Instead, she adjusted her chair by a single inch. It was a gesture so small, so controlled, it felt like a monumental act of defiance. Ben Carter whispered into his mic, his voice electric with the gravity of the moment. "That's it. That's the moment," he said. "Calm doesn't equal credibility. That phrase is going to live on the internet forever by morning." A murmur of outrage ran through the crowd, louder now than the jazz quartet's uneasy, faltering notes. The guests were no longer neutral observers. Some frowned openly. Others whispered their disgust. A woman near the bar hissed under her breath, loud enough for those around her to hear. "She hasn't done a damn thing. This is nothing more than prejudice dressed up as hotel policy." But Eleanor Vance only laughed harder, her voice a shrill echo under the chandeliers. "Escort her out. Do it now. She has already ruined this entire evening." And as Davenport nodded grimly, turning to signal to the hotel's security team, who were now approaching from the back, the fragile balance of the ballroom finally began to tilt toward its breaking point. The ballroom had gone preternaturally still, like a stage waiting for the final brutal act of a tragedy. Davenport's signal was all it took. Two security guards, Large men in dark, impeccably tailored suits moved from the back wall. Their earpieces glinted under the chandelier light as they closed in on the table. Eleanor Vance stepped aside with a deeply satisfied smirk, clearing a path for them as a queen might for her executioners. One guard reached for the place card, which was still clutched in Davenport's trembling hand. The other leaned toward Serafina, his voice a low, firm command. "Ma'am, you need to stand up now." She did not move. Her stillness was no longer just calm. It was a form of resistance sharper and more powerful than any physical struggle. Eleanor scoffed, her voice dripping with the finality of her triumph. "She won't stand because she can't. She doesn't belong. Just take her out." And then it happened, an act of such deliberate public humiliation that it sucked the remaining air from the room. Davenport, in a gesture of ultimate dismissal, snapped the place card in half. The sound of the thick cardstock splitting was shockingly loud, a sharp crack that echoed across the glass and marble. He then tossed the two pieces onto the table in front of Serafina, as though he were shredding not just a name, but her very identity, her right to exist in that space. "This is invalid," he repeated, his voice louder now, laced with a desperate finality. "You have no seat here." Gasps scattered through the room like sparks from a fire. A woman near the stage covered her mouth with a horrified hand. A man at the bar muttered, his voice a low growl of disbelief. He really did it. He tore it right in front of her. Phones rose even higher, a forest of lenses catching every angle of the desecration. Ben Carter whispered fiercely into his mic, his professionalism cracking. "They destroyed her card. This isn't policy anymore. This is a public shaming. This is pure humiliation." Serafina remained steady. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap. She didn't even glance at the torn card. She just looked at the manager, her gaze as steady and unyielding as stone. But the assault was not yet over. The second guard, seeing she would not stand, reached for the elegant clutch resting on the back of her chair. He lifted it, holding it in his palm as if it were contaminated, and then turned to Davenport for his next instruction. "Check it," Davenport ordered, the words leaving his mouth with cold certainty. "Make sure nothing inside is stolen." That one word, stolen, burned through the ballroom like acid. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some gasping outright in shock. The thin veneer of civility had been completely stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly prejudice beneath. Eleanor Vance laughed, a short, sharp bark, as she tipped her champagne glass. "You see? Exactly what I said. The pretenders always get caught in the end." The guard, following orders, opened the clutch. Inside, nestled against the silk lining, was a single card. It wasn't a credit card. It was a solid piece of black, anodized titanium. It caught the light with a heavy, unmistakable gleam. It was an American Express Centurion card, the legendary Black Card, an object of such extreme exclusivity that most people in the room had only ever heard rumors of its existence. Instead of shocked recognition, Davenport sneered. "A fake," he declared, his voice filled with contempt. "They make convincing copies of these online now." He snatched it from the guard and tossed it back onto the table. It landed with a heavy metallic clang that seemed to reverberate louder than the band's next nervous note. A murmur of disbelief spread like wildfire. Someone at the back whispered urgently, "That's a Centurion? You don't fake a Centurion card? The weight is unmistakable." Another guest, a banking executive, nodded, frowning deeply. "This is going too far. This is insane." Eleanor Vance, sensing the kill, leaned in. "Call the police," she hissed at Davenport. "Let her explain her story to them. Maybe a night in a jail cell will finally teach her where she does, and does not, belong." The word police landed like a hammer blow, shattering the last vestiges of decorum. Gasps broke into open protest. A man in a tuxedo barked from his table. "This is absolutely insane! The woman hasn't done a single thing wrong!" A woman near the bar shouted, her voice ringing with outrage. "Stop this! This isn't security, it's harassment!" But Davenport was already pulling his own phone from his jacket pocket, his movements sharp and jerky. He held it to his ear. "Dispatch," his voice carried clearly across the silent room. "This is the St. Regis Grand Ballroom. We have an intruder. Possible fraud. Request immediate police response." And as his voice echoed off the gilded ceiling, every guest, every camera, every single eye in that ballroom knew a line had been crossed from which there was no return. The night was no longer just about an insult. It had become a public execution of dignity. Davenport's voice was still echoing into his phone. "Request immediate response," when the woman in the orange gown finally moved. It was not an abrupt movement, not a gesture of anger or fear. It was a single, precise, and devastatingly calm motion. She reached for her own clutch, lifted her sleek black smartphone, and pressed a single button on her screen. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. But it was perfectly calm, perfectly clear, and it cut through the room with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It carried farther and with more authority than Davenport's frantic call ever could. "Activate withdrawal protocol." The room froze. Guests exchanged confused glances. The security guards hesitated, their training offering no guidance for this scenario. Even Eleanor Vance tilted her head, her triumphant smirk flickering with a tiny spark of confusion. On the other end of Serafina's line, a woman's voice responded instantly. The voice was sharp, efficient, and unwavering. "Confirmed, Ms. James. Protocol activated. Divesting $4.1 billion from all holdings and partnerships associated with the St. Regis and its parent corporation, Marriott International. Execution is in progress." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They fell into the opulent ballroom like blocks of iron, heavy, cold, and irreversible. Ben Carter's whispered narration cracked with sheer disbelief. Did you hear that? 4.1 billion, with a B. She's pulling billions of dollars out, right now." Gasps swelled into full-throated exclamations. A man at the bar dropped his glass, the sound of it shattering on the marble floor barely registering. "She's not a guest," he muttered, his eyes wide. "She's a major shareholder." A woman nearby clutched her pearl necklace, whispering, "No, more than that. Much more. She's in control." Eleanor Vance tried to laugh, but the sound that came out was a strangled, hollow croak. "A bluff," she stammered, trying to regain control. "It's all a bluff. No one moves that kind of money with a single phone call." But her eyes betrayed her. They darted around the room, a flicker of panic, a flash of profound unease. Serafina James remained steady. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply set her phone down flat on the white linen, the line still open. The assistant's crisp voice was still audible in the dead silence. "Phase 1 of withdrawal confirmed, Ms. James. Funds have been redirected. Media alerts and SEC filings are prepared for immediate release." Davenport's own phone, still pressed to his ear, began to tremble in his grip. He slowly pulled it away, staring at his screen, as if hoping the 911 dispatcher on the other end could somehow save him from the cataclysmic truth that was unraveling at his feet. The security guards froze completely, their faces pale, suddenly uncertain of who, exactly, they were supposed to be handling. Ben Carter whispered again, this time almost to himself, his voice filled with awe. "She just shifted the tectonic plates of the entire room with a single sentence." Serafina James folded her hands, her eyes calm, her posture still unbroken. She hadn't raised her voice once all evening. yet the very ground beneath the St. Regis was cracking open. And for the first time all night, Eleanor Vance lost her smile. The blood drained from her face, leaving her painted red lips looking like a grotesque wound. The ballroom, and everyone in it, held its breath. The manager Davenport lowered his phone, his call to the police forgotten. The guards had taken a full step back, their faces a mask of confusion and burgeoning fear. They looked like statues, uncertain of their purpose, their eyes darting between the woman in orange and the sea of guests whose phones were now held aloft like weapons in a courtroom of public opinion. Eleanor Vance clutched her champagne glass, her knuckles turning white, the last bastion of her crumbling authority. And then, Serafina James, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that held a controlling stake in the hotel's parent company, rose to her feet. It wasn't a rushed movement. It wasn't dramatic. It was a slow, deliberate, unhurried motion that made the 1,000 crystal chandeliers seem to dim in comparison. The burnt orange satin of her gown cascaded to the floor, catching the light like a river of quiet fire. She placed one hand on the table, her fingers spread wide, as steady as the roots of an ancient oak tree, and she spoke, for the very first time that evening. "You think I'm staff?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried an impossible weight. It cut through the ballroom sharper than shattering crystal, silencing every rustle, every whisper, every breath. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, every syllable pulling them closer into her orbit. "You think I don't belong here? You think my silence was surrender?" She straightened to her full height, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, across the glowing phone screens, and finally, landing like a physical blow on the woman in red who had dared to try and erase her. "I am Serafina James," she declared, her voice resonating with the quiet, unshakable power of absolute truth. "I am the founder and CEO of Onyx Capital, the firm that owns a controlling stake in this hotel, in its parent company, and in the entire chain of properties it represents." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the marrow of the room. "Every chandelier above your head," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more powerful than a shout. "Every crystal glass in your hand, every single inch of this ballroom you stand in, exists because I allow it to." A sound like thunder erupted through the room. It was the sound of 200 people gasping at once. Ben Carter nearly dropped his phone. Someone at the back shouted a raw, visceral, "Oh my God!" Eleanor Vance stumbled back a half step, her smug mask of superiority completely collapsing into a void of slack-jawed silence. Her wineglass, forgotten in her hand, slipped from her trembling fingers. It fell to the floor, shattering against the marble with a sharp crack. Red wine bled across the pristine white floor, a spreading stain that could never be erased. The manager's face drained of all color, leaving it a sickly, pale gray. His hand still held the 2 pieces of the torn place card, the fragments of his own career, now trembling uncontrollably between his fingers. For the first time, he realized he hadn't just destroyed a piece of paper. He had shredded proof of his own catastrophic failure. And Serafina James, the CEO, stood unmoved by the chaos she had unleashed. She let the silence stretch, her presence seeming to expand, filling every corner of the vast ballroom. She didn't need to argue anymore. The truth had detonated, and the room itself was now carrying the echo of its blast. Ben Carter's whispered narration had cracked, his voice filled with pure, unadulterated awe. "She owns it. Holy hell, she owns all of this." The phones kept recording, the guests kept staring, and the woman in the red dress, once so loud, once so powerful, now had nothing left to say. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been completely and irrevocably annihilated. The ballroom cracked wide open. The initial shockwave of gasps rolled into a tidal wave of murmurs, which in turn swelled into shouts of disbelief and exhilaration. Guests were rising from their chairs, their faces a canvas of astonishment. The forest of glowing phones now hovered high, a constellation of digital witnesses ensuring every second of this historic takedown was captured, every angle preserved for eternity. Davenport's hand trembled violently, the two pieces of the torn card fluttering between his fingers like dying moths. His lips parted, but no words came out, only a dry, croaking sound. He looked at the shredded fragments of Serafina James's name as if they were the shards of his own life. Sweat gathered at his temples, trickling down his pale face. His voice, when it finally broke free, came out as a brittle, shattered whisper. This can't be real." The security guards, who minutes ago had been ready to physically drag her from the room, had stepped so far back they were nearly pressed against the wall. They could not meet her eyes. One muttered to the other, his voice a low groan of horror. "She runs the whole damn company. We touched her clutch." The second guard just shook his head, his face completely drained of color, the full weight of his colossal misjudgment crashing down on him. And Eleanor Vance, the billionaire's wife, the catalyst for this entire implosion, found her facade not just cracked, but shattered into a million pieces. The supreme confidence that had animated her every word, her every gesture, collapsed in a single, devastating heartbeat. She tried to laugh, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control, but the sound that escaped her throat was strangled and thin, like the sound of broken glass being ground under a heel. "You're lying," she hissed, her voice ragged. "This is a trick. My husband. Arthur knows everyone who matters in this city. He would have told me about you." But the crowd, her former jury, was no longer listening to her. They had already delivered their verdict. The woman in the emerald silk gown stood up from her table, her voice ringing with conviction. "We all saw it. We heard the call. She's not bluffing." A man near the bar raised his phone higher, like a torch of truth. "This video feed is already live. There are thousands of people watching. Everyone knows who she is now." Ben Carter's voice cracked with awe and adrenaline as he narrated for his rapidly growing audience. The St. Regis Gala is in chaos as witnesses confirm that Serafina James, the CEO of Onyx Capital, just revealed she owns a controlling stake in the hotel chain after being publicly humiliated by another guest. This is corporate history. This is social justice, unfolding right before our eyes. Davenport stumbled backward, his headset finally sliding loose from his ear and clattering to the marble floor. He turned toward the stage, his eyes darting around wildly, searching for an escape that did not exist. The eyes of the entire ballroom had pinned him in a spotlight of his own making. Then, something extraordinary happened. A single guest began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate applause. Then another joined in, and another. Soon, it was a wave, gathering strength, rolling through the chandeliers until the applause was a deafening thunder. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a judgment. It was a roaring condemnation of the arrogance, the prejudice, the public humiliation that had just so spectacularly imploded. Eleanor shook her head violently, her diamond earrings swaying. "No," she shrieked, trying to be heard over the applause. "No, you don't belong here. This night is ours." But her voice was a pathetic squeak, drowned out by the relentless, heavy roar of the crowd's approval for Serafina. Some guests were cheering outright. Others were shouting words that cut Eleanor sharper than any crystal. "Respect her. She owns this place. Justice! Right here. Right now." The billionaire's wife staggered, suddenly looking frail and small in her crimson silk. Her power, built on a foundation of money and a husband's name, was crumbling around her like the shards of her broken wine glass, still bleeding their stain across the marble floor. And at the center of it all, Serafina James stood calm. The flame-colored satin of her gown rippled softly around her, as if she were completely untouched by the hurricane of chaos she had just unleashed. The room had chosen its side. The thunderous applause had not yet faded when Serafina reached for her phone again. There was no rush, no theatrics, just a calm, deliberate tap on the screen. The connection to her assistant reopened. "Status," she said. The single word cut through the ballroom like a judge calling for order. On the other end, her assistant's voice was crisp, clear, and undeniable. "Withdrawal is complete, Ms. James. $4.1 billion have been liquidated from all St. Regis and Marriott-affiliated properties and funds. All related contracts have been flagged for immediate review. The media brief is finalized and ready for release on your command." The room gasped as one, as if the air had been collectively punched from its lungs. On a large screen near the stage, which had previously been scrolling a list of donor tributes, something new appeared. It was a live feed of market data. Numbers began to roll across it, holdings, stakes, funds dissolving in real time. The stock of the hotel's parent company was plummeting in after-hours trading. Guests craned their necks, their jaws hanging open. Davenport stumbled back another step, his headset now lying forgotten at his feet. "No," he whispered, his voice broken. "No, this can't be happening." Serafina turned her gaze upon him. It was steady, and it was merciless. "You tore my name in half," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a landslide. "Consider your employment to be the same. Effective immediately, you are dismissed." His mouth fell open. Around him, murmurs exploded into exclamations. Guests whispered in disbelief. "She just fired him, right here, in the middle of the ballroom." Her eyes, cold as obsidian, slid from the disgraced manager to the two frozen security guards. "And as for you," she said, her voice unwavering, "you touched what was not yours. You acted on arrogance, not evidence. Your badges are invalid. The new head of security will escort you out of the building you no longer work in." The guards froze, then seemed to shrink. They lowered their heads, the full realization of their actions sinking into their shoulders like a physical weight. Finally, she turned her attention to the woman in the red dress. To Eleanor Vance, the billionaire's wife who had thrown every insult, who had weaponized the entire room against her, who now stood pale and trembling, her voice caught in her throat. "You," Serafina said, the word landing with devastating precision. "You thought humiliation was a form of power. You mistook my silence for weakness. Let me give you a lesson that will last you a lifetime. My silence is more expensive than your husband's entire empire." Eleanor Vance staggered, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her mouth opened, but no words came out, only a faint, choked sound. The phones of the guests caught the moment perfectly, every angle preserving her downfall, her complete and utter ruin, immortalized in a million pixels. Serafina lifted her own phone one last time. "Mark," she said into it, addressing her assistant, "every vendor, sponsor, and benefactor contract connected to tonight's gala. Terminate them all, effective immediately." "Confirmed, Ms. James," came the instant reply. And just like that, with a few quiet words, deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars evaporated into the rarefied air of the ballroom. The gilded walls of the St. Regis seemed to groan under the sudden, immense weight of the loss. Guests muttered in disbelief, some in shock, others in a state of profound awe. Ben Carter's voice cracked with emotion as he provided the live narration to a global audience. "She's dismantling their entire ecosystem. Not tomorrow, not next week, right now, in front of everyone. This is corporate justice being served in real time." Serafina James set her phone down, her hands folded once more, her expression as unshaken as it had been at the start of the night. She didn't need volume. She didn't need fury. She had just written the verdict, executed the sentence, and the entire world was watching it unfold. The ballroom was silent again, but this was a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of tension. It was the silence of judgment delivered, of a new power revealed. The chandeliers still glittered high above, but the brightest, most undeniable light in the room now radiated from the woman in the orange gown. Every eye was fixed on her. Every phone remained raised, recording history. Eleanor Vance stood frozen in her crimson silk, a trembling statue in the ruins of her own making. The manager's headset lay forgotten on the marble floor. The security guards had receded into the shadows, ghosts of the power they once thought they held. Serafina let the silence breathe. She let it stretch and deepen until the full weight of the evening settled on every shoulder in that room. Then, she spoke one last time. "You thought I needed your approval to belong," she said, her voice carrying across the silent space, not loud, but absolute. It traveled across glass, velvet, and marble, sinking into the consciousness of every guest, every witness, every person watching on a screen miles away. "You thought that by erasing my name from a piece of cardstock, you could erase me. You were wrong. I don't need your cameras to prove what happened here tonight," she continued, her eyes sweeping the room. "Because I am the result of every camera, every insult, every attempt to silence a person like me throughout history. I am not the footage of what you did. I am the verdict." Gasps rippled through the stunned crowd. Someone clapped, and then another. The applause swelled again, this time not just as a judgment on Eleanor, but as a tribute to Serafina. It rolled like thunder across the ballroom, wave after wave, until it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Ben Carter's voice, trembling with awe, whispered into his mic. "She just ended it. That's the line. That is the one the world will remember." Serafina turned, one last time, toward the woman in the red dress, her final words as sharp and as clear as a diamond. "Dignity," she said, "does not ask for permission. It defines the room." Eleanor Vance finally lowered her eyes, her shoulders folding in utter defeat. There was no defense left, no laughter, no fight. Only the kind of silence that cuts deeper and lasts longer than any insult. Serafina James gathered her clutch, lifted her phone, and began to walk. She walked past the manager who once dared to tear her name in two. She walked past the shattered glass and the spreading red stain on the floor. The guests parted before her like the Red Sea, clearing her path. Some bowed their heads in respect. Some whispered blessings. All of them knew, with absolute certainty, that they had just witnessed something far larger than a society scandal. They had witnessed justice in its purest and most potent form. At the grand doorway, she paused. The polished marble floor still reflected the image of her burnt orange gown, unshaken, unstoppable, unbreakable. She turned back once, her eyes sweeping across the ruined ballroom one final time. "Remember this moment," she said, her voice a final, powerful echo. "Because my silence was never weakness. It was power, waiting for the right stage." And with that, she left the St. Regis Gala in the smoldering ruins of its own arrogance. Not by shouting, not by fighting, but by standing so firmly in her own truth that an entire empire had been forced to collapse around her. The applause, the thunderous, unending applause, followed her out into the night. What did you think of that ending? This story is a powerful testament to the fact that true power isn't loud, isn't arrogant. It's resilient, it's patient, and it knows its own worth. If this story moved you, Please share it with one person who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible stories of justice and empowerment. Thank you for being a part of this community. We'll see you in the next one.